Hello and welcome to day 15, and we have reached the Book of Kings. Now, just like the book of 1 and 2 Samuel, which is divided in half simply because of the weight of the scroll, 1 and 2 Kings is much the same. It is a single book, should be reviewed as a single book, split in two simply for pragmatic reasons. So we're going to look at this, I think, in three sections. Certainly today we're going to look at the first, I don't know, was it 15 chapters or something? And then we come to a kind of different flavour to the book. So we'll break it there and then pick that up again tomorrow. So let me tell you a little bit about the Book of Kings. So Kings picks us up really from the end of David's reign until the end of the nation of Judah. Spoiler alert, at the end of the Book of Kings, not today, we won't meet this, but in a couple of days' time, the nation of Israel and Judah, and at that point they're two nations, and that'll become clear in a minute, they both go into exile and they lose their land. Now, you may remember that was one of the things that was warned about in Deuteronomy 28. If the consequences of failing to keep the covenant in the end would be loss of the promised land, and this is what we're going to see in the Book of Kings. So the time of the monarchy from David until the end of the monarchy. Today we're going to look at the first 15 chapters or so. So the story opens with David being very old. He's old and he can't get warm, and a young woman is brought to him to lie in bed beside him and keep him warm. Her name is Abishag, and he is too... it has been said he was too virtuous, but I don't think that's a word that we would rightly apply to David. He's too old, quite frankly, to be able to avail himself of the charms of this woman. So she simply lies in bed beside him and keeps him warm. Now, there's something here that we are supposed to notice here, really, about David as an old man who is now probably impotent. And not just sexually impotent, but actually kind of politically impotent as well, because now we're going to see some more power jostling, and David is going to be manipulated. The first thing that happens then is one of his sons, Adonijah, rather fancies going for the throne after his father dies, and he can see that day is coming. And so Adonijah makes a power play, at which point the prophet Nathan and Bathsheba start to plot against Adonijah, and they manipulate David. Bathsheba goes at Nathan's prompting. Now, Bathsheba goes into seeking David, and she says, "You remember, you promised the throne to Solomon." That's her son, of course. "You promised the throne to Solomon." And David says, "Oh, I guess I did." Actually, we have no record that David promised the throne to Solomon. So there is this kind of lingering question of whether David had promised it and we're just not told that, or whether simply this is an act of political manipulation. I rather suspect the latter. So on the basis of this manipulation, David makes Solomon king, and Solomon is anointed king in David's own lifetime to try and shore up the succession. So that's the end of chapter 1. In chapter 2, David makes his dying charge to Solomon. At the end of chapter 2, David is going to die, but we get his dying words, and basically he says three things to Solomon. First of all, in a very positive way, he says, "I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong, show yourself a man, observe what the Lord your God requires, walk in his ways, keep his decrees and commandments, his laws and requirements." So he charges his son to keep the covenant and to follow God. However, he then gives him two other instructions. The first one is Joab. Now, concerns Joab. Do you remember Joab? Joab was David's henchman. He was David's, what is the word I'm looking for? That, he's the enforcer, the one who kind of gets his hands dirty, so David can say, "Oh, it wasn't me." And David's dying charge to Solomon is kill Joab. His other dying charge to Solomon, it concerns someone called Shimei. Now, I mentioned him briefly yesterday, and Shimei was someone from the house of Saul who, when David was leaving Jerusalem in temporary exile because his son had rebelled against him, Shimei ran along beside him, throwing things at him and jeering at him. And at that point, David seems to act with great restraint, and some of his advisors said to him, Your Majesty, Shimei, you should get even with him. And he says, oh no, let it be, let it be. But here in his dying moments, his words to his son are, do not let his grey hair go down to the grave in peace. Have your vengeance upon him, have my vengeance upon him. It's a sorry moment, in my opinion, in David's life at the end of his life. Second half of chapter 2 then, as David dies and Solomon establishes his throne, and there's lots of manipulation, lots of manoeuvrings, but Solomon consolidates power. And by the end of chapter 2, Solomon is firmly established on the throne. Chapter 3, we get a well-known passage where God appears to Solomon and says, how would you like me to bless you? And Solomon asks for wisdom, which God says he will give. And Solomon has this reputation for being extremely wise. However, we need to understand what wisdom is in the Hebrew Bible. Wisdom, as we're going to see when we come to the book of Proverbs, not too long away now. Wisdom is the fear of the Lord. It's honouring and worshipping God. It's walking in God's ways. It's not simply about kind of human shrewdness or cunning. So was Solomon wise? Well, kind of yes and kind of no, I think. We see moments when he exercises great wisdom, but we're going to see moments when and increasingly as his life goes on, moments when he exercises great folly. And in actual fact, this claim to wisdom, even in this chapter, is subverted. First of all, he's made an alliance with the king of Egypt, and he's married the king of Egypt's daughter. He has no business marrying outside the kingdom. And to go back to Egypt, to go and make an alliance with Egypt, Egypt being that nation that the people had to escape from slavery from. This is a moment of unwisdom, and it is the first of many moments of unwisdom in Solomon's life. In this chapter, we also get the story of the two prostitutes who have two babies, one of whose babies dies, and Solomon judges which mother should be allowed to keep the living baby. Now, in the next few chapters, we're going to get an increasing catalogue of Solomon's wealth, his power, and his extravagance. So, chapter 4. Let me just read you a few verses from verse 22. Solomon's daily provisions were these. This is for his household. 30 cores of fine flour. And a core, or 30 cores, is about 6.6 thousand litres of fine flour. 60 cores of meal, that is about 13.2 thousand litres of meal. 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 head of pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, and deer, and gazelles, and roebucks, and choice fowl. That is how much he and his household ate every day. Vast extravagance. Hold that thought, we're going to meet some more of that in a minute. In chapters 5 to 7, we get an account of the building of the temple and of Solomon's palace, and this is also done with great extravagance. And I think if you read the account of the building of his palace, it is at least as extravagant as the building of the temple, and that should bother us. In chapter 8, the Ark of the Covenant is brought to the temple, and the temple is finally dedicated, fulfilling, of course, Solomon's father David's dream. Now, do you remember what happened when the tabernacle was dedicated back in Exodus? At the dedication of the tabernacle, the glory of God, that theophany, came down in smoke and fire, and the priests couldn't do their job because the glory of God was so powerful and intense. At this dedication of Solomon's temple, the very first temple in Israel, exactly the same thing happens. Chapter 8, verse 10. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. I have to say, I think that at the dedication of the tabernacle and here at the dedication of the temple, we start to see subversion at their very inception, that when the presence of God comes, the priesthood is somehow redundant. Now, the priesthood is never really functionally redundant in the Old Testament. That's going to happen in the New Testament. But I do think we see a glimpse of that foreshadowed at the dedication of both the tabernacle and then of the temple. Solomon makes a prayer of dedication at the temple, often viewed as a great prayer of faith. I think even here we have a certain amount of kind of slightly sideward squint at Solomon. It sounds like he's trying to tame God, really. So even though he says this, chapter 8, verse 27, I've built this temple for you. Will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? But I have built you this temple and I kind of expect you to live here, is the implication. And then he says this, and this sounds very much like he's making a bargain with God and trying to make a kind of contract with God. May your eyes be open towards this temple night and day. Hear the supplication of your servant. Hear from heaven. When someone wrongs his neighbour and then comes to ask for forgiveness, then declare him not guilty. When your people Israel have been defeated by an enemy, and when they come back and pray for and confess and ask for forgiveness, then forgive them. When there's drought and the people turn back to you and ask for your forgiveness, then forgive them. And it's kind of he's kind of giving God his instructions here, really. He's not behaving like a man who has just seen the glory of God fill the temple. He's sounding quite arrogant, I think. Anyway, in chapter 9, God appears to Solomon and he reminds him of his covenant responsibilities. However, remember that extravagance that we started to see in verse 4? Now we're going to get more and more of that extravagance becoming apparent. So, second half of chapter 9, we get an account of Solomon's forced labour. Listen to this, verse 15. Here's an account of the forced labour King Solomon conscripted to work on the temple. And then he describes the people that have been conscripted. Hold that thought. We're going to come back further to forced labour and extravagance in a minute. Then we get the Queen of Sheba coming to visit Solomon. The Queen of Sheba comes from Africa. She has heard of his great wisdom and she comes to check out if he's really as wise as she has heard. And he shows her he is as wise as she has heard. And she's also very impressed with his wealth. And she goes back deeply impressed by his wealth. There are legends, not in the Bible, but there are legends that he fathered a child with her. There are also legends that the Ark of the Covenant was later sent to the Queen of Sheba. We don't really meet the Ark of the Covenant much after this, and it definitely drops out of the story later on. And there are legends that the Ark went back with Sheba to Ethiopia, and it is there to this day. That's just a legend. We don't know what happened to the Ark. But certainly this is quite a strong, a powerful moment when this woman travels a long distance to hear the wisdom of the Davidic king. There's something symbolic going on here as well, and we'll pick up on that in days and weeks to come. Chapters 10 to 11, we hear more about Solomon's wealth and of his wives. Now, one of the things that Samuel said to the people when they wanted a king was he said, he'll take many wives, he'll conscript your people into forced labour. And one of the warnings about what a king should not be like, which we read in Deuteronomy, here we start to see Solomon being an exact replica of what a king should not be like. So chapter 11, the beginning of this chapter. King Solomon loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. He loved Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians and Hittites. He is going to have thousands of wives and concubines. Well, certainly hundreds and reaching up towards 1,000 wives and concubines. This is extravagant even in the customs and the habits of the day. What's more, his wives are going to lead him into idolatry. Verse 7 of chapter 11. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. So as predicted, his foreign wives, who have brought their other gods with them, cause him to lead Israel into idolatry. A very serious moment. Chemosh, I think I mentioned when we looked at the story of Ruth, Chemosh was the god of the Moabites with a taste for human blood. Molech, the detestable god of the, who was it? The Ammonites, I think. Molech demanded child sacrifice. These cults are not simply idolatrous, they are deeply, deeply evil. And Solomon is starting the dalliance, which will never wholly leave the nation now. Let me just backtrack slightly to chapter 10, where we read more about his wealth, about him receiving 666 talents of gold. That is about 22.5 tons of gold in tribute from other nations every year. Nothing, verse 21, nothing was made of silver. Silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. This is talking about his great wealth, but also his many wives and his idolatry. Now, in the last few minutes, I want to talk about what happens after Solomon's death. Towards the end of Solomon's life, a man called Jeroboam is promoted to great prominence, and then he goes into rebellion against Solomon. The rebellion is quashed and Joab goes into exile, but he is waiting in the wings, and he is going to cause trouble after Solomon's death. Solomon dies at the end of chapter 11, and his son Rehoboam succeeds him. Now, Rehoboam is approached by a deputation from the peoples, and they say, "Sir, your father was a very harsh ruler. He had conscription, he had heavy taxation. I didn't mention that, but heavy taxation, forced labour. Could you ease the people's burden a little bit?" And Rehoboam takes advice from his friends, from the young men. The older men of Solomon's court, his father's advisors, say, yes, that's good advice, but the young men don't think that's good advice. They urge him on to be brash and aggressive, and he gives it quite an aggressive, brash response to this deputation, saying, "You ain't seen nothing yet. My father whipped you with whips. I will whip you with scorpions." And because he threatens to be and starts to be such a brutal king, there is a civil war, and up steps Jeroboam, who I mentioned just a minute ago. So we've got Rehoboam, David's grandson, and Jeroboam, who leads a rebellion against him. And as a result of Rehoboam's unwisdom, this nation of Israel now splits in two and will never be reunited. Important moment historically. The southern kingdom is now going to be called Judah, because most of it is made up of the tribe of Judah, with one or two other little bits added. The northern kingdom keeps the name Israel. So the united kingdom was called Israel, but after this civil war, they split, never to be reunited. Judah in the south, Israel in the north. Okay. What we're going to get now for the next few chapters, we're going to get an account of some of the kings of Judah and some of the kings of Israel. In Judah, in the south, Judah incidentally contains Jerusalem, contains the temple. In the south here then, we're going to have the Davidic monarchy is going to continue. Every new king who comes will be descended from King David. Remember that promise that God made David, you will never fail to have a man on the throne. So let me take you quickly through the first few kings of Judah that we meet in these chapters. First of all, as I've said, we have Rehoboam. Now, each time we hear about a king, we're going to get an evaluation of their reign. This is going to be given to us. So, the evaluation of Rehoboam's reign. Chapter 14, verse 22. He was 41 years old when he became king. He reigned for 17 years. Dum-de-dum-de-dum. Verse 22. Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And one of the things that Jeroboam does, which is regarded as particularly... Rehoboam does, sorry. Let me hold that thought. So Rehoboam does evil in the eyes of the Lord. He is succeeded by Abijah, 15 verse 3. What was he like? He reigned for 3 years. He committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David had been. Now, then he is succeeded by Asa. 15 verse 11. What was Asa like? Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He expelled the male shrine prostitutes from the land, and he got rid of the idols, and he cut down Asherah poles, which is kind of trees where people worshipped false gods, and he was wholly devoted to the Lord all his life. So we're going to get these evaluations, and each time it's, were they like David? Did they follow like David followed, or do they follow other gods? So this is the sort of evaluation we're going to get. That's from the southern kingdom. Then we're going to get the kings of Israel in the north, beginning with Jeroboam, the one who led the rebellion. Now, Jeroboam does what is regarded as almost a kind of primal act of rebellion. And what he does, and we get this in chapter 12, is he sets up 2 golden calves for worship. And these, the cultic centres, they're going to be called, are Bethel and Dan. Now, why does he do this? He does this because his territory does not include Jerusalem, so he does not have a temple in the land that he governs. Because he doesn't have a temple, he doesn't want his people going south to worship at Jerusalem. That would destabilise his own power. And so he sets up 2 centres of worship in his own territory, and he puts golden calves there to for people to worship. So this is regarded as a primal act of idolatry and rebellion, and everybody, all the kings that follow, are going to be compared with him. They were like Jeroboam, who does this primal act of evil. So he is succeeded by Nadab, chapter 15, verse 26, who I think is his son. Yes. Verse 26, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, walking in the ways of Jeroboam his father. Nadab is succeeded by Baasha, verse 34 of the same chapter. Baasha did evil in the eyes of the Lord, walking in the ways of Jeroboam. You hear this pattern now. Baasha is succeeded by his son Elah. And Elah only reigns for 2 years, chapter 16, verse 9, because there is a coup then. Now, unlike the kings of Judah in the south, where there is an unbroken Davidic monarchy, in the north, things are politically very unstable from time to time. And here's the first moment of instability, where Elah, after 2 years of reigning, is succeeded by Zimri, who exercises a coup against him. Chapter verse 9. Zimri doesn't enjoy his kingship for very long. In fact, he is only king for 7 days. And after 7 days, the army puts Omri in charge instead. So there's another coup. And Zimri responds to that. Well, first of all, I should say he's killed off the entire family of Baasha, whose family he has exercised the coup against. But then when he discovers that he's been plotted against, he burns. Here we are, chapter 16, verse 18. When he realizes he's been defeated, he goes into the citadel of the royal palace and he sets the palace on fire around him, and he dies. So he only enjoys his reign for 7 days, and Omri is placed in his stead. Omri is going to be a very wealthy king. He's going to make the northern kingdom, the nation of Israel, very prosperous in his time. And the house of Omri will last for a little while. And Omri how is he evaluated? Chapter 16, verse 25. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he sinned more than all those before him. He walked in the ways of Jeroboam, again being compared to this first king of the northern nation. Omri does something quite strategically important. He buys a hill from someone called Shemer, and he makes that his capital city, and it becomes called Samaria. So Omri is the first person to establish the city of Samaria, which is going to be the capital city of the northern nation of Israel. Hope I'm not losing you. And then finally, as we finish today, Omri's son Ahab becomes king. What sort of king is Ahab? Verse 30, Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, but he also married Jezebel. And when we pick it up tomorrow, we're going to learn more about Ahab and Jezebel in the north, and about 2 prophets who were raised up by God to speak to him. See you tomorrow.